It seems impossible, but this is it, my friends, my family. This is the first episode of Gameplay, the series I might have announced over a year ago, maybe about this long ago. Podcasters, I'm signaling at my beard. And I'll say it up front. If you want them quicker, okay, the remaining episodes might come quicker than a year between each, but if you want them even quicker, if you want to be a friend and or family member and aren't yet, Patreon is the thing. So you shouldn't have to look far to find a link to that, no matter where you are. And I know this probably all looks pretty familiar at this point. This is where I film the majority of my projects and have been doing so for over a year now. But as the title might suggest, I'm also going to show you a fair amount of gameplay with this series. Again, for anybody not tuning in podcast form. And it's actually been pretty fun figuring out the hardware and whatnot to get that footage. Unless otherwise noted, it is all footage that I myself have captured. But this is not going to be one of those videos you see that does an exhaustive treatment or a game or franchise. This is going to be more of a mid-level thing, as is a lot of the content on my channel, with heavy personal experience. It's how I choose the games. I'm choosing ones that I've always liked or that are at the top of my list, but it's also how I like to talk about them. Not that it won't also be factual. I'm a nerd for history and culture several times over, but it's not going to be exhaustive. Again, if you want those videos, they're out there. I probably watched a few to get this far, but this is not that. This is me. This is my lens. And speaking of lenses, this story actually starts in 1993 with Canon. And I know they make a ton more than lenses, but that's obviously how I know of them more than anything, given my profession and whatnot. They, like everybody else in the 90s, had their hand in 2D image processing, as you might imagine. And Canon's European Research Center had its eye on straight up 3D graphics, it turns out. So they formed a little studio, although they didn't call it a studio yet, called Criterion Software, right there in Guildford in England. And they released something called Renderware, which to this day is probably still one of my favorite names for software that renders. It's like if you named your car drive vehicle or something like that. It's all in the name, the entire thing. And Renderware is basically a software library, so something other companies could use to create their own software, 3D graphics, whatever it might be, kind of like a game engine, which is exactly what it turned into. So the other thing companies would do, they still do this actually, but when they have a library or an engine, is they'll create a demo to showcase it. And what makes a flashier demo than a video game? So in '94, they made something called Cyber Street, Criterion did. And you can find footage of it on YouTube thanks to Spacehead. I was not able to emulate in this anyway to capture the footage. But it's kind of a Doom-like where you run around shooting rats, I believe, if you can make those out. But it's fun. It's a cool little thing, and I'm sure it turned some heads at the time. But other companies were making full-on games with what they had. So in '96, Criterion Software staffs up, expands to new offices, still in Guildford, and rebrands itself as Criterion Studios. And it develops games like Scorched Planet, Speedboat Attack, and a game called Trick Style, which if you go back and look at all three of those games, they all have some sort of driving or racing element to them. But the other thing that happened in the 4-ish years it took them to develop those games is that Renderware reached its third version and basically was a full-on game engine at this point, so that it was ready to take full advantage of what they released in 2001, a game called Burnout. They developed it in tandem with Acclaim, and it basically centers around weaving in and out of traffic. You can get near misses by coming close to other vehicles, and if you're in oncoming traffic, that will also build your boost meter. And if it gets full, you can use it, and if you use it all in one go, it's called a burnout. And I have to say, for a 22-year-old game on an Xbox that I bought to play it for the first time, feels pretty good. Weaving in and out of traffic is fun. The drifting is there, which is an excellent litmus test for any racer as far as I'm concerned. Drifting feels good. You can kind of jostle traffic in a way. You can get used to how it moves based on where you're at or how you do your near misses, and you can learn to game that in a way. It's a lot more simmy than you might expect, certainly for a Burnout game. The cars have kind of a weight to them. They kind of bounce around on those shocks. You don't have any control over, like you're not switching parts in or out to change the handling of your vehicle or anything like that. In fact, I want to say the game itself only features like 4 different vehicles total, and I don't think they have names. I think they're just named like easy, medium, and hard, which I don't know exactly what changes there. Knowing racing games, the speed probably goes up and the handling goes down to some extent, or you're more dependent on drifting at that point. But again, it feels good, so I stuck with the hard vehicle most of the time in this game anyways from the very beginning. But I'd still say this is an arcade racer, obviously. And the arcade elements that are there are solid. Again, the oncoming, the near misses, the burnout, like they've built a base that's going to serve them well for game after game, in my opinion. But you'll notice I haven't said anything about takedowns yet, taking down other vehicles, rivals, whatever. Burnout 1 does not feature takedowns, really. And this is kind of the biggest revelation, for me anyways, playing this game. I don't know how it came across at the time, but again, given on what we'll talk about for the sequels, I think I wasn't alone. Taking down other vehicles becomes the emergent part of the gameplay. So if you haven't heard that term before, emergent gameplay is kind of the thing that maybe wasn't on the top of the design document, but certainly surfaced somewhere along the way. Sometimes I think even after release. But to me, taking down other vehicles, kind of forcing them into a situation where they would crash, because you do crash in this game still, becomes part of the game whether it's included expressly or not. And why I think I'm not alone in that is by 2002, when they released the sequel, Burnout 2, it's subtitled Point of Impact. So Criterion, now straight up Criterion Games, again in tandem with Acclaim, puts out Burnout 2. And honestly, it doesn't look a ton different from Burnout 1, but its identity is focused. Again, point of impact, right? All of the tutorial lessons point towards driving in oncoming traffic, getting those near misses with other vehicles, drifting, catching air, and burnouts function much in the same way. But also you can chain everything, so you're getting multipliers. So the arcadey stuff is already getting dialed up here in Burnout 2. And honestly, you just have much more of a game here than you did with the first one. You've got the single player campaign wherein you unlock more and more vehicles. You can use those vehicles in the additional modes that they've introduced, like Pursuit for the first time, which might actually now feature takedowns, although I don't think they call them that specifically yet. And it's much more of a binary affair. There's not much of the dynamism that you'll see later on in later entries in the series. You've kind of just, you're a police officer chasing down another vehicle, and if you touch them, it takes a tick away, and if you touch them enough times within the time limit, they are stopped. So that's pretty much it. But the new mode that really had me jumping that shows up here in Burnout 2 and that becomes a staple for the series is Crash Mode. So it is an early version of Crash Mode still. There's no aftertouch. Like you're basically just going for a point of impact, and kind of what happens from there. It's still a very compelling 3D puzzle of sorts. That's kind of what they would cash in on later on with this mode. It's still fun. Again, they've still found just a base level fun thing that only gets better from here on out, and it's still great here in Burnout 2. The other thing I want to mention that's going to become a bigger part for the series also is the music. I didn't mention it for the first one because it's pretty generic. It's also generic here. You're not going to hear any licensed tracks, but it's woven into the game in a way that would become emblematic for the series. They boost it once you boost the car, so it really, especially if you're playing with headphones on or something like that, it really gives the energy. It really hypes you up when you hit the gas. But for all that, it seems that not many people took notice of the franchise still in the States, except for EA Games, who took over publishing duties for the next game in 2004, Burnout 3, subtitled Takedown. And again, this is something that I feel like I'm not alone in for this reason. It started out as kind of this emergent thing that is becoming a focus for this series, and with excellent reason. In Burnout 3, everything gets an upgrade. Again, Renderware is doing the heavy lifting, and it looks great. But the thing about Burnout 3 that I think really signaled where the franchise was headed, but also took everything to the next level, is that this is basically their first stab at world building. And I haven't talked much about the tracks in each of the games. They do have an identity to them, and I think they're very well designed and they're fun to drive, all that stuff. But in Burnout 3, they have names, They exist in parts of a place called Silver Lake. And again, if you're listening to the music, they've kind of taken a page out of GTA's book, and they have an announcer wherein he calls out these places, calls out things that have happened at these places, at specific parts on the tracks in these places. And by the way, the music is licensed in Burnout 3, and it's pretty darn good. I mean, it's very appropriate for the time period in 2004. There's lots of pop punk, but there's also lots of, I guess some people might still call pop punk. It's certainly second or third wave, but Pennywise, Bouncing Souls, Future Heads, Ramones, it's all pretty listenable, and this would only become a stronger point of the series, I think, as it went on. Also, the soundtrack for Burnout Paradise is like regrettably enjoyable at points. Anyway, the gameplay for Burnout 3 is also next level. You get everything from the other games, plus rubbing, shunting, smashing, and takedowns, yes, by name. With aftertouch, after you've crashed, you can hold down on the button and slightly guide where your car goes, so you can get in the way of oncoming cars and take them out and get an aftertouch takedown. All of that with RPG hooks, right? This was also that time where RPG hooks were just showing up in every single game. Burnout was no different. You've got overarching challenges, you've got signature takedowns that you can kind of collect depending on where you take down your rivals, collectible postcards, headlines, and you're unlocking cars like crazy. Just every other race, it seems like. I think it's based on, like, you have a number of gold medals, also it tracks number of takedowns, and you're hitting these milestones and it'll unlock cars. I just played it again. I think I might only be 5 hours total into it. By the way, I completed Burnout 1 and 2. There's not a lot of game there, but still the fact that I kept playing them to completion is something. Burnout 3, I haven't done that because there's so much more game there, but I find myself still, again, 5 hours in, unlocking cars like almost after every race. So lots of stuff there. Crash mode is back. It gets jumps, it gets bonuses, and it gets crash breakers, the thing where if you build up enough of a wreck or wreckage, you can explode your car and take out more wreckage. And of course, they've included aftertouch here now, so there's much more of that 3D puzzle aspect going on as you float around and try to get different bonuses and stuff like that. I find the fixed camera is still something they're working on at this point. I mean, cameras in games, we're probably still working on that, period, generally. But if I had to give anything a needs improvement, it might be that at this point. But in the end, it doesn't matter, and it didn't matter then because Burnout 3 did well enough that EA just bought Criterion outright for $68 million that same year. And in about 1 year's time, 2005, they released Burnout Revenge. And this is where I came into the series, right? This is the game that turned Burnout into one of my favorite franchises of all time. Burnout Revenge might be the most iterative entry in the series. You're not going to see a ton of differences or additions gameplay-wise between Burnout 3 and Burnout Revenge. It's a cross-gen title, so you kind of get the feeling they just wanted to have something for the new consoles at the time too, the 360 and the PS3 it would have been. But did I go back and spend $10 on it just to play another hour or so of it for this video? Absolutely. I did, and I don't know if it's just the rose-tinted glasses or the nostalgia, but man, that game holds up. It really seems like it holds up. It's over the top, everything is still dialed up, but man, it's fun. It might just always be fun. If it's iterative, and it is, they have owned it to a razor-sharp point. And it's full-featured regardless. I mean, I would not say that if you've played Burnout 3 very recently like me, you might be less inclined to enjoy Burnout Revenge. But if, like me, you have played Burnout Revenge and love it so much that you still love it when you play it now, that you've become newly hooked on Burnout 3, there's a lot to appreciate between both of them either way. And I think we'll leave it there for the first episode of gameplay. We're not done with Burnout games yet. Burnout Paradise comes out in 2008, but given that that pretty much signals the advent of the modern racer, I think we can tie that into what is to come a little bit better. So thanks for hanging out. Again, you're going to find me on YouTube and on the Ryan Runs podcast feed and on Patreon /Ryan_runs_ if you want to contribute to this and if you want to see more of these. So I appreciate anybody who has done that so far. You're going to see their names in a second. But to anybody who's watched this at all, thanks.